They were the right sort of people. They had the right accents and the right schools and the right clubs. They were charming, brilliant, well-connected, the kind of young men the British establishment looked at and saw its own future. And that is exactly why they got away with it for so long. Because while they were rising through the Foreign Office and the Secret Services and the heart of the British state, 5 of them were working, patiently and in secret and for years, for the Soviet Union. They handed Moscow atomic secrets, the inner workings of British and American intelligence, and the names of agents who would die for it. They are remembered as the Cambridge Five, and they carried out the deepest betrayal of a nation's secrets by its own elite that the 20th century produced. This is their story, and for once, we can tell a great deal of it from the documents themselves, because the files have finally begun to open. The British Security Service has released its own dossiers on the ring, including transcripts of the interrogations, the bugged phone calls, the surveillance reports, the confessions. Some of it was opened only very recently. A great deal of it is still closed even now. But what has come out lets us watch, in the spies' own words and their pursuers' own memos, how it happened, how it was hidden, and how agonizingly close Britain came again and again to catching them sooner. To understand the Cambridge Five, you have to go back to Cambridge University in the early 1930s, and to the particular despair of that decade. The Great Depression had thrown millions out of work, and made capitalism itself look like a failure. Fascism was rising across Europe. Hitler was coming to power in Germany, and to a generation of idealistic young students, it seemed that the old order was rotten and the Western democracies were too weak or too compromised to stop the coming catastrophe. In that climate, communism and the Soviet Union that claimed to embody it looked to some of the brightest students at Cambridge not like a threat, but like the only force serious about fighting fascism. It was, for them, the cause of the age. Soviet intelligence understood that appeal, and it played a long game that was breathtaking in its patience. A talent spotter working for Moscow, an Austrian operating under deep cover, moved through Cambridge, identifying the most promising of these young believers. He was not looking for people who would throw bombs or hand over a single document and disappear. He was looking for young men of exactly the right background who could be told to do something far more valuable. Bury your communism. Hide it completely. Pretend to drift to the right. Become respectable, and then walk calmly into the British establishment, into the Foreign Office, into the intelligence services, and rise. Become the very people Britain trusts with its deepest secrets, and then give those secrets to us. It was recruitment not for a mission, but for a career, a 30-year investment in young men who would mature into the perfect spies, hidden inside the system itself. And it worked, because the system helped them. The British establishment of that era recruited heavily on exactly the qualities these men had. The right family, the right university, the right manner. Vetting, such as it was, often came down to whether a man was known and liked by the right people. Whether he was, as the phrase went, one of us. A communist of working-class background would have been watched. These men were waved through, because the idea that a product of that world could be a Soviet agent was almost literally unthinkable. Their class was their cover, and it was nearly perfect. Consider where they ended up. Kim Philby, perhaps the most damaging of them all, rose high inside MI6, the British Foreign Intelligence Service, the very organization charged with running spies against the Soviet Union and catching Soviet spies in Britain. At one point, he headed the section devoted to anti-Soviet counterespionage, which meant the man in charge of hunting Soviet penetration was himself the penetration. He later served as the MI6 liaison in Washington, with access to the secrets of both the British and the American services. Donald Maclean climbed the Foreign Office and handled some of the most sensitive Anglo-American business of the early atomic age. Guy Burgess moved through the Foreign Office and the orbit of the secret world, a flamboyant, hard-drinking man who somehow kept being forgiven. Anthony Blunt worked inside MI5, the domestic security service, during the war, and afterward became a distinguished art historian, eventually knighted, a man who advised the royal household on its paintings. And John Cairncross worked at Bletchley Park, the code-breaking center, and passed the Soviets both signals intelligence and material on the atomic bomb. Guy Burgess deserves a moment of his own, because he is the figure who should never have survived inside a secret service for a single year, let alone for many. He drank to excess, talked too much, lived a chaotic and openly scandalous private life, and was forever causing the kind of embarrassment that would have ended an ordinary career. By any rational security standard, he was a walking liability, a man who knew enormous secrets and could not be relied upon to stay sober at dinner. And yet he was protected, forgiven, reassigned, kept inside the circle, again and again, because he was charming and clever, and above all, because he was one of them. The very recklessness that should have exposed him was instead read as harmless eccentricity, the indulged bad behavior of a brilliant insider. That a man so obviously unreliable could hold sensitive posts for years is the clearest possible proof of how completely the old assumptions had replaced actual security. The system did not vet character. It vetted background, and Burgess had the right one. Look at that list again. Foreign intelligence, domestic security, the Foreign Office, the codebreakers, the atomic program. Among them, the five had a hand in nearly every compartment of the British secret state and a pipeline running straight to Moscow. For the better part of 2 decades, some of the most important secrets Britain held, and many it shared with the United States, were read in the Kremlin almost as soon as they were written in London. What did that betrayal cost? The full account is still not entirely known, but pieces are stark. Cairncross's material from Bletchley and elsewhere fed Soviet intelligence on Western code breaking and on the atomic project. Philby, in his counterintelligence role, was positioned to betray Western operations against the Soviet bloc, including, by many accounts, efforts to support resistance behind the Iron Curtain that ended in disaster and death for the agents involved. When your enemy knows the operation before it begins, the people sent on it are walking into a trap. The Cambridge Five did not just leak paper. They compromised human beings, and some of those human beings did not come home. There is one case in the newly released files that captures the human cost with terrible clarity. While Philby was stationed in Turkey, a Soviet intelligence officer named Konstantin Volkov approached the British and offered to defect. Volkov was offering to name Soviet agents working inside the British establishment, which is to say, he was offering, without knowing it, to expose Philby and the others. The matter was handled in London by, of all people, Philby himself, who made sure Moscow was warned. Before the British could spirit Volkov out, he and his wife were seized and taken back to the Soviet Union, where they were killed. Decades later, in his own confession, Philby made a fleeting admission that he had passed on information about Volkov. A man who tried to come over to the West, and the wife beside him, paid with their lives so that Philby could keep his cover. That is what these elegant, witty, well-connected men were actually doing. The unraveling, when it finally came, began not with a brilliant interrogation, but with mathematics, with the codebreakers we met in the last file. American and British cryptanalysts working on decrypted Soviet messages, the project called Venona, had begun to pull cover names out of the traffic. One of those cover names belonged to a Soviet source operating inside the British embassy in Washington, with access to the highest Anglo-American secrets. Slowly, painstakingly, the evidence narrowed the field, and by 1951, it pointed unmistakably at one man, Donald McLean. The net was closing. MI5 put McLean under surveillance, hoping to catch him in the act and build a case. But the ring protected its own. Philby, in Washington, knew about the Venona investigation, knew the trail was leading to McLean, and knew that if McLean were arrested and broke under questioning, the whole network, Philby included, could come down. So a warning was passed. Guy Burgess, who had been staying in Philby's own house in Washington and had been sent home in semi-disgrace, carried the alarm back across the Atlantic. In May of 1951, just as the British were preparing to confront McLean, he vanished. And he did not vanish alone. Burgess went with him. The two men slipped out of England and surfaced years later in Moscow. Two senior figures with access to the nation's secrets had simply evaporated, days ahead of the trap, which told any competent observer that they had been tipped off, which told them there was at least one more spy still in place who had done the tipping. Suspicion fell almost at once on Philby. He had been close to Burgess, had housed him, and had been in a position to know about the McLean investigation. He became known as the third man, the one who had warned the other two. And here the released files become extraordinary, because we can now read the interrogations. Philby was summoned home and questioned. One of the most senior figures in British counterintelligence interviewed him, and the transcripts show Philby doing what he did best, deflecting, explaining, turning the blame toward Burgess, presenting himself as a loyal officer embarrassed by a reckless friend. Then came a far more aggressive session, an interrogation by a sharp barrister brought in to break him, an exacting, forensic attempt to corner Philby into a confession. The lengthy transcript of that encounter survives, and what it shows is telling. Philby did not confess, but under the barrister's relentless questioning, he frequently had no real answer. The interrogator was morally certain. He simply could not prove it, not to the standard required, not against a man this composed and this well protected, by the assumption that one of us could not possibly be guilty. So Philby was not charged. He left the Secret Service, but the suspicion clung to him, and for years he existed in a strange limbo, privately distrusted by many and publicly undefeated. Then, remarkably, the establishment closed ranks around him. In 1955, after his name had surfaced in the press as the suspected third man, the Foreign Secretary stood up in Parliament and effectively cleared him, stating that there was no reason to identify Philby with the warning of Burgess and McLean. Philby gave a now famous press conference, calm and faintly amused, denying everything in his perfect establishment voice. He was so convincing, and the desire to believe him was so strong, that he was brought back into the intelligence fold in a quieter capacity and posted to Beirut as a journalist. The man the evidence had been screaming about for years was given another decade of freedom by the simple unwillingness of his own class to believe what was in front of them. The reckoning finally came in the early 1960s. New evidence emerged, including testimony from someone who had known the ring, and at last the proof against Philby became undeniable. In January of 1963, an MI6 officer, a man who had been Philby's friend, flew to Beirut to confront him. The files generated by that encounter include Philby's confession statement, dated the 11th of January 1963, a partial confession admitting that he had spied for the Soviet Union from the 1930s into the 1940s. It was incomplete, self-serving, full of gaps he refused to fill, and it hardly mattered in the end, because before the British could bring him home, Philby did what Burgess and McLean had done. He disappeared, surfacing months later in Moscow, where he would live out his life as a Soviet citizen, decorated by the KGB, a defector to the cause he had served in secret for 30 years. That left the question of how many more there were, and it leads to the most discreetly shocking chapter of all. Anthony Blunt, the art historian, the royal advisor, the knighted pillar of the cultural establishment, had been a Soviet agent inside MI5 during the war. In 1964, a man Blunt had known at Cambridge and had once tried to recruit finally named him. Blunt was confronted, and he confessed. But here is the part that tells you everything about how this world worked. Blunt was not arrested. He was not tried. He was not publicly exposed. Instead, he was secretly granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for telling MI5 what he knew. And then he was allowed to go on with his life, keeping his royal position and his knighthood and his reputation, while the fact of his treason stayed buried inside the security service. For 15 years, the British public had no idea that one of the most honored figures in the art world was a confessed Soviet spy. It only came out in 1979, when an investigative writer pieced it together, and the Prime Minister was forced to confirm in Parliament that yes, Blunt had confessed to spying for the Soviet Union 15 years earlier, and yes, he had been protected. The establishment had caught one of its own, and rather than face the scandal, had quietly hidden him. That is 4. Philby, McLean, Burgess, Blunt. The 5th member of the ring is where the firm history shades into genuine debate, and an honest account has to slow down here. The man most often named as the 5th is John Cairncross, who admitted passing material from Bletchley Park and elsewhere, and whose role fits. But the precise membership of the ring, and the identity of a definitive 5th man, has been argued over for decades. At one point, the accusation reached extraordinarily high, when a former officer claimed in a notorious memoir that the Director General of MI5 himself had been a Soviet agent. That allegation has been widely rejected by other historians and was never proven, and I am not going to repeat it as fact because it is not established as fact. The honest position is that the core of the ring is well documented, that Cairncross is the usual and best supported answer for the 5th, and that beyond that lies a fog of claim and counterclaim that the still closed files have not entirely cleared. Where the record is solid, I will tell you, and where it is contested, I will tell you that too. There is one more consequence worth naming, because it shows how a betrayal like this poisons everything downstream of it. Once a service learns that it has been penetrated at the highest level for 20 years, it can never again be sure it is clean. The discovery of the Cambridge Five touched off a long and corrosive era of mole hunting inside British and Allied intelligence, a hunt for the spies who might still be hidden. Officers turned on one another. Careers were destroyed on suspicion alone. The search for further traitors reached, as we have seen, all the way up to an accusation against the head of the service himself, an accusation never proven and widely rejected, but impossible to fully kill once the idea had taken hold. This is the cruelest secondary damage a deep penetration inflicts. It is not only the secrets that are lost, it is trust itself, the basic ability of an intelligence service to believe in its own people. And that kind of suspicion, once released, does not easily go back in the box. The Cambridge Five robbed Britain of its secrets in their active years, and then robbed its Secret Service of its peace of mind for a generation afterward. What I can tell you without hesitation is why this case matters so much. Beyond the spy novel glamour that has grown up around it, the Cambridge Five represent the most successful, long-term penetration of a Western intelligence establishment in the history of the Cold War. For 2 decades, Britain's secrets, and through Britain, a great many of America's, flowed to Moscow from the very top of the system. The damage to Anglo-American trust was severe and lasting. The Americans, who had shared their most sensitive secrets with their closest ally, discovered that the Allies' services were riddled with Soviet agents, and the relationship never fully recovered its old innocence. And the deepest wound was to the idea at the center of British public life, the assumption that a certain kind of person of the right background and the right schools could simply be trusted. The Cambridge Five were proof that the establishment's faith in its own was not a security system. It was a blind spot, and the Soviets had aimed straight at it. There is a reason their own service fought so hard for so long to keep the files closed, releasing them only in fragments and keeping much sealed even now. A betrayal like this is not just an operational failure. It is a humiliation that reaches into the heart of how a country sees itself. The documents that have come out, the interrogation transcripts where Philby calmly parries a man who knows he is guilty, the secret immunity deal that shielded Blunt, the surveillance reports, and the confessions are the record finally catching up to the legend, and they are not flattering. They show a security establishment repeatedly outmaneuvered, not by foreign genius alone, but by its own reluctance to suspect the right sort of people. And that is the lesson that outlasts the Cold War. The Cambridge Five did not break in from the outside. They were invited in, welcomed, promoted, and defended, because they looked and sounded exactly like the people doing the inviting. The most dangerous spy is not the stranger at the gate. It is the trusted insider who is never really questioned, because questioning him would have meant questioning the whole comfortable assumption that people like us do not do things like that. Britain learned that lesson at appalling cost, and the files it kept sealed for half a century are still, even now, only partly open. What there is, you can read. The interrogations, the confessions, the memos of a service slowly, painfully realizing how deep the rot had gone. Read it yourself in the links below. The next file is already on the table.